Welcome students to the lecture on topic Marxist theory of historical materialism. In this lecture, we will discuss the idea of the dialectical materialism as the philosophical foundation of Marx's materialist theory of history. Marx's theory of history as the basis of his overall social philosophy. The Marxian theory of social change and revolution as a means of the social development of man. And finally, we will discuss various basic concepts like mode of production, social base, and ideology used by Marx in the development of his theory of history. Dear students, there are various facets of Marxian contribution. Marxist philosophy has social, economic, political, anthropological and psychological aspects and dimensions. Almost all of these are grounded in Marxian theory of history. Karl Marx highlighted the exploitation, alienation and dehumanization present in the social, economic and political organization of the modern capitalist society. Marx, as a revolutionary thinker, sought a way of changing this situation. Hence, he, on the basis of his understanding of historical processes, developed a general theory of the social development of man. The overall philosophy of Karl Marx is grounded into his overall theory of history that explains the development of human society in material and economic terms and in relation to a continuous conflict among the contending classes. His understanding of the matter is as something dynamic and self-creating or evolving in relation to the creative interface with man. He refers to this as dialectical materialism, something different from historical materialism but fundamental to its explanation. These two theories are fundamental, interconnected and basic to his materialistic interpretation of the development of human society. For Marx, social change is rooted in the division of human society on economic terms between haves and have-nots. This to him is fundamental to his theory of class conflict, that is, the conflict between economically dominant and economically deprived classes. The nature of the composition of these classes is different at different levels of societal development. For Marx, society has evolved through different stages of social development in terms of the different evolving modes of production. All the aspects of Marxian philosophy are actually rooted in his theory of history, generally referred to as the theory of historical materialism or the materialist interpretation of history. Marxist view of history involves the idea of development. This development, according to Karl Marx, takes place in accordance with certain given and fixed laws. This development has taken place from primitive communism through slave society, feudalism, capitalism, and in due course is likely to develop into socialism and finally communism. Marx considers social revolution as natural and desirable. He thought of social revolution necessary in the path of social development of man. Marx argues that the revolution is a sudden change which always follows a period of gestation and evolution even in nature. There are various examples in natural and human history where a gradual process has led to a complete transformation. Therefore, for Marx, social revolution is as natural a phenomenon as the boiling of water. A social revolution is therefore an important part of social development. Marx explains this process of the transformation in human history through a series of revolutions in material terms. In order to explain this process, he takes recourse to his specific explanation of the dynamic nature of matter in his theory of dialectical materialism. Karl Marx agreed with Hegel that history is a process but disagreed about the nature of that process. Hegel interpreted human history in terms of the primacy of ideas and consciousness. Marx accepted the developmental aspect of Hegelian dialectics, but he did not agree with Hegelian view that it was ideas or the spirit which provided the driving force in history. Instead, Marx explained the historical process in terms of primacy to the material forces. Marx asserted that it is not the consciousness of men which determines their existence, but on the contrary, their social existence determines their consciousness. Marx borrowed the concept of dialectics from Hegel and applied it to his own conception of the primacy to material forces. For him, matter has its own creative dynamics through which it evolves and shapes social reality. This happens by working out of the tension between nature and man, successive social formations and competing social classes. Dialectics is a process which characterizes historical change as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The synthesis combines the best characteristics of both thesis as well as antithesis. Each stage in the process of transition presupposes that in due course it will give place to another. So, in the material interpretation of history, Marx used the Hegelian concept of dialectics with fundamental modifications to explain the basic causes of transformation in society. Marx accepted the Hegelian proposition that saw history not as static but rather as a movement. Both agreed that history is not a series of straight, disjointed incidents which is impossible to predict as to how it will shape itself. Instead, they both see that history has a movement and a direction. Thus, Marx thought that society is always in motion. This change is always in the direction of progress. Marx, however, differed from Hegel in a fundamental sense. Hegel applied the dialectical method as a means of rational explanation of the development of history. He asserted that the social development was result of the historical evolution of the divine idea or the world spirit. He argues that the society's movement from Oriental despotism through the Greco-Roman stage to modern Europe is actually the process of the enlargement of freedom. The driving factor in this process was the idea or the spirit. In contrast, for Marx, it is the material forces as means of production that are at the base of this change. In his book, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, Marx declared that the history of society is the history of material production and of the contradiction between the material productive forces and the relations of production which arise on the basis of them. This contradiction is resolved through the class struggle. Therefore, in his interpretation of history, Hegelian dialectical idealism becomes dialectical materialism for Marx. Therefore, Marx claims to have turned Hegel upside down and set him right side up. Now, dear students, let's discuss Marx's theory of historical materialism. Marx develops materialistic interpretation of history by applying dialectics for explaining social progress in terms of material changes. He argued that man is constituted by his desires, his economic needs, work, and the economic system of which he is a part. For him, economic activity determines the basis of all other activities of man. The political system, legal framework, and moral concepts are all derived from the way in which economic activity is structured. Social existence is essentially a series of production relations corresponding to a definite mode of production. In his book, A Critique of Political Economy, Marx distinguished between economic base, that is, the mode of production, and the superstructure which constitutes culture, politics, philosophy, literature, etc. History, according to Marx, is a record of the self-development of productive forces. Each stage is characterized by social formation which has its own distinct mode of production. Thus, the society has evolved through various stages, that is, the primitive communism, the slave society, the feudalism, the capitalism, and finally the classless society of the future. This will be the culmination of human progress and will lead to man's complete emancipation. Each of these stages is determined through a corresponding mode of production. Thus, with change in mode of production, society itself changes and a new social formation comes into existence. Each of these stages is objectively superior to the earlier social formation because it brings relation of production in line with the change in forces of production. Marx believed that the most fundamental element in society was the technological and economic, upon which was built the social, political and religious superstructure. Marx's argument was that the nature of economic relations of a given society is dependent upon the mode of production of that society. Marx argued that every mode of production has certain distinct relations of production. There is, in other words, a certain linkage between the mode of production and the relations of production. What Marx means by the relations of production is the sort of relations in which men enter for the purposes of production. For instance, around land there used to be landlord-tenant relations. With the development of industry and factory system, we have now the relations between the factory owners or entrepreneurs and the workers. Marx asserted that the overall social relations of a community are primarily dependent upon the mode of production and the resultant relations of production. This is the controlling element around which all other factors revolve. The nature of the mode of production determines class relations of that society. It is always the class which owns the predominant means of production of the society, which is wealth in the economic field, holds prestige and status in the social life and control over political power. Not only that, even the ideology in that society, that is, its system of beliefs and values, is determined by that mode of production. It also works in the interests of the dominant class of that society. Marx argued that it is the economic base of the society which is central to the understanding of the society and its development. For him, society has evolved through various stages of development shaped by certain logic of material and economic development. Marx saw that each stage or epoch created a new class that would lead to its downfall. These stages are primitive communism, slave society, feudalism, and capitalism. The first three stages are not given particular attention by Marx, since by his time they had gone a long time before. As such, he does not provide the principles of these stages as he does for capitalism and the stages that he thought will follow. He gives an extensive exposition of how capitalism developed as per the general logic of his materialist theory. For example, it is the development in science and technology that facilitated the development of industry. The industry laid the foundation for development of capitalism, replacing feudalism. Development of capitalism changed the whole political face of the Europe, bringing a series of revolutions that transferred power from nobility to the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class. Prominent among these are the Glorious Revolution of England in 1688 and the French Revolution in 1789. Marx in his writings developed an extensive critique of capitalism, highlighting its exploitative character and inner contradictions. Marx thought the conflict between labor and capital is inherent in capitalism. It was bound to become increasingly sharp. One, or rather the major reason, is the expropriation of surplus value by the capitalist. Marxian concept of surplus value is drawn from his theory that all value belonged to the labor. This position has certain ethical and moral overtones. Marx maintained that since labor creates all value ought to go to the labor. It is from this position that Marx derived his idea of surplus value. If all value belonged to the labor, but the laborer was being paid only a part of this value by way of wages, the balance was being wrongfully appropriated by the capitalist entrepreneur. This misappropriated part of the value by the capitalist entrepreneurs is what Marx refers to as surplus value. It is precisely because of this surplus value that, according to Marx, crises and depressions become a periodic phenomenon of capitalism, leading to unemployment and misery among the working class. Depression leads to failure of business and the unemployment of middle class and smaller businessmen. Having no or little cushion pushes them down into the ranks of the working class. One of the major features of capitalism is the increasing polarization of society and the pauperization of the workers. Almost inevitably, along with it, there is the tendency towards the concentration of capital. This tendency results from at least two factors. For one thing, every major new technological advance is capital intensive and naturally favors those who have the capacity of higher investment. Secondly, in the 19th century competitive world of capitalism, it was difficult to have continued success in business. In the cutthroat competition, many small businessmen were pushed out of the market and had no option but to join the ranks of those in search of employment. Marx therefore concluded that the number of property owners would inevitably dwindle and that of the workers would continue to increase, thus bringing capitalism increasingly under pressure. Marx was convinced about the revolutionary potential of the working class, which he thought would be the chief, or rather the only instrument to overthrow the capitalist system as perceived by him. Since Marx believed that consciousness is determined by the social existence, he concluded that the poverty, misery and increasing pauperization of the working class would make them conscious of the exploitation that they undergo, and they will unite to break the shackles of the capitalist trapping. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels declared that the workers of the world should unite as they have nothing to lose but their chains. Through this critique, Marx predicted the eventual downfall of capitalism and the creation of a socialist system as a prelude to communism. However, the Marxian prediction of increasing exploitation of workers, depleting middle class, etc., and imminent workers' uprising was, however, not to prove true. And as early as late 19th century or early 20th century, critiques were prompt to point out that not only the workers had not become poorer, indeed there had been a significant improvement in their conditions. During the course of the 20th century, some of the basic assumptions of Marxism, particularly about transition from capitalism to socialism, have been severely criticized and contested. It was with the object of meeting this effective criticism that Lenin felt obliged to write his well-known pamphlet on Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, to address some of this criticism. In spite of certain major setbacks, Marxism continues to inspire people for its worth as a philosophy of change, methodology of social analysis, and conceptual contribution that enriches and facilitates our understanding of the contemporary situations and developments. Attempt will be made to discuss this and other aspects of the Marxian thought in a future lecture. With these words, dear students, I conclude this lecture. Hope you find this lecture useful and informative. I will meet you again with a new lecture. Till then, goodbye and God bless you.